Hello, my name is Chip, and I'm the pastor here at Union Church. Greetings to you, whether you're watching this stream right here in Taunton, or if you're halfway across the globe and you found us just randomly online. Either way, we're happy you're here. And what we started to do last week is a new series called Wisdom for Troubled Times. Whether we like it or not, COVID has given us more space to think. This is likely one of the reasons why we see so much support for the Black Lives Matter movement. It's because we don't have the ability to distract ourselves like we used to from these issues of racial injustice. We don't have the ability to look away like maybe we used to. But it's also a season of life when God calls us to consider our own lives. In Ecclesiastes 7, verse 14, God tells us, when times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider. God has made the one as well as the other. Fools rush in, but in the midst of trouble, God invites us to consider how we've been living our lives. And today, God invites us to consider meaning. We're going to be looking together at one of the chief obstacles to experiencing purpose in our lives. And then we're going to spend some time viewing the way that God breathes purpose back into our lives. First, we have this universal problem of looking for meaning in our lives and instead finding that purpose to be elusive. Beginning to read Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. If those words sound vaguely familiar to you, it's because you're a deep, constant reader of the book of Ecclesiastes. No, probably not. But they are the words crafted by Paul Seeger, not to be confused with Bob Seger, who wrote the song for many 60s bands, including the Byrds in the song Turn, Turn, Turn. You'll remember this song. It goes to everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And what is particularly interesting about that song and about the critic here in Ecclesiastes is the seemingly elusive meaninglessness of life caught in that slow, inevitable march of time. When the Byrds sang that song in the 60s, it was in the midst of civil rights and protesting violence. Does that sound familiar today? And so, although at first reading Ecclesiastes 3 might sound positive, it's actually decrying the elusive meaning of a world where dying happens as much as living, uprooting happens as much as planting, and killing as much as healing. We might have thought all that overstates things back when we were distracting ourselves in early March. But then you get to verse 5, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, which is coupled with that even more depressing observation, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, as in a time to build and a time to tear down those buildings. Today we might say it like this: the more things change, the more they stay the same. Or meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Or, well, that's just the way it is. Ecclesiastes 3 comes to the conclusion in verse 9. What does the worker gain from his toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on men. And then jumping down to verse 19, humans' fate is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Man has no advantage over the animal. Everything is vapor. All go to the same place. All comes from dust, and to dust all return. What the critic in Ecclesiastes is getting after is that none of us can cheat time. None of us can cheat time. Well, what do we do with that? First, we might remember another great American rock song, this time Dust in the Wind. All we are is just dust in the wind. But more seriously, one of the things we might try to do is hope things will be better at a different stage of our life. We'll just be blind optimists. Jason Lehman, a 14-year-old kid from New Haven, wrote to her grandmother a poem, which her grandmother then sent along to Dear Abby back when that was a thing in the newspapers. And it talks about the problem of optimism. It was spring, but it was summer I wanted. The warm days and the great outdoors. It was summer, but it was fall I wanted. The colorful leaves and the cool, dry air. It was fall, but it was winter I wanted. The beautiful snow and the joy of the holiday season. It was winter, but it was spring I wanted. The warmth and the blossoming of nature. I was a child, but it was adulthood I wanted. The freedom and respect. I was 20, but it was 30 I wanted. To be mature and sophisticated. I was middle-aged, but it was 20 I wanted. The youth and the free spirit. I was retired, but it was middle age I wanted. The presence of mind without limitations. My life was over, and I never got what I wanted. Now keep in mind, this is a 14-year-old kid who wrote that, and he wrote it in 1989. We might hope for things to be better later, but there doesn't actually seem to be much consolation there. So what do we do instead? Mostly, I think, every day we try to distract ourselves from fate, from how we clock in and clock out and try to make a difference, but we have this sneaking suspicion inside that maybe we aren't. Graciously, God offers us another way. None of us can cheat time, but we can know the one who does. Reading from Ecclesiastes 3, verse 11. God has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men. Yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for men than to be happy and do good while they live, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing taken from it. God does it so that men will revere him. There is a seasonal pattern built into the cycle of life, whether it's spring into summer, youth into old age. God has given a time for everything and a season to every activity under heaven. We are normally powerless to change the seasons themselves, whether it's the COVID season of refraining from being able to embrace, or seeing beloved institutions torn down, or, God forbid, weeping for lost loved ones. We are powerless to stop these changes. But what a relationship with God does is it allows us to experience these events as meaningful rather than as meaningless. We can't change time, but we can have a dynamic, living relationship with the God who gives time and invites us to experience the march of time as a gift rather than something as meaningless, as something God calls beautiful rather than claustrophobic. I once heard Peter Kraft, a theologian at Boston College, describe it this way. He said in college, your philosophy professors may try to trick you into thinking everything's meaningless, that there's nothing real in this world. Don't try to answer them in that moment. Just know when you are changing your own baby's diaper, you will look back and laugh at that college situation. There are some things about this world that are messy and don't make any sense, and yet are filled with such profound purpose that they can't be meaningless. Maybe it's a wedding or the birth of your child. For most of us, I think it's when we first encountered God. It was just a moment in time, but it was a moment that broke into the cycle of life and told us that meaning and purpose out of all our monotony is not only possible, but real. You'll forgive me if I quote one more poem today. We are, after all, talking about the very meaning of life. One of my favorite poets, Auden, wrote about the difference between ordinary days and our days when we're in a relationship with God. Quoting, "The world of space where events reoccur is still there, only it's no longer real. The real one is nowhere, where time never moves and nothing can ever happen. I mean that although there's a person we know all about still bearing our name and loving himself as before, that person has become a fiction. Our true existence is decided by no one and has no importance to love. That is why we would despair. That is why we would welcome the nursery boogie or the wine cellar ghost. Why even the violent howling of winter and war has become like a jukebox tune that we dare not stop. We are afraid of pain, but more afraid of silence. My faith that in time's constant flow lay real assurance broke down on this analysis. At any given instant, all solids dissolve, no wheels revolve, and the facts have no endurance. And who knows if it is by design or pure inadvertence that the present destroys its inherited self-importance. With envy, terror, rage, regret, we anticipate or remember but never are. To remember how to be living now is the reason I follow this star." Auden puts these words in the mouth of the Magi seeking the star at the birth of Jesus. And for us today, the way out of meaninglessness and experiencing instead deep purpose and meaning in the midst of our limited days is by encountering the Lord, who makes our time and gives meaning to each moment. The Gospels describe the days before God came to be with us as ordinary time, or as Ecclesiastes describes, as elusive, vapor-filled time. But since Christ has arrived into this world and into our lives, the Gospels use a different word for time. Kairos, or appointed time. A life with Christ, friends, isn't a life when the hands just tick endlessly around the circle of a clock. They are a life filled with direction and meaning and purpose. If COVID has taught us one thing, it's that none of us can cheat time. But thanks be to God, we know the one who through the cross and the empty tomb